Well, there's also a big difference between psychopaths and non-psychopaths. I mean, we're talking about Do No Harm, and the character at the center of Do No Harm is not a psychopath. I went and studied the entire history of psychopathology thinking I was going to make a psychopath.
Right.
And what I found is the reasons why I found it less compelling to write, which we were talking about. But I mean, psychopaths literally have a disconnect between emotion and action. They can't attach to it. So if they're in an interview and they're saying, oh yeah, you know, I took the girl and I cut her up into little pieces, and they'll cue off the horrified face of the interrogator and say, oh yeah, it was really awful. They require other people's facial expressions to be able to make assessments. And so if you have a character like that moving through fiction, you know, your options are limited for where you leave them because they're truly not able to be rehabilitated. Like, there's nothing that's redeeming about someone who's a true psychopath.
Well, I agree, and therefore, to me, not all that interesting, other than you can generate some excitement in the chase, you know, but will he catch him, won't he? But I mean, how's that different than going after the dragon? I mean, the dragon in Quest fiction was the dragon, you know.
The ultimate, you know, archetype.
Yeah. You have a medical background of some sort?
No.
No.
I mean,
somebody in your family,
Oh,
though,
yeah,
right?
but my family, I'm from a family of doctors on one side.
I thought that we discussed that when you came to
Yes,
sign
we have.
Do No Harm.
I thought you meant me personally.
No, I'm sorry, I didn't say it very well. But what I meant was that you're not unfamiliar with this whole field of, you know, medicine, hospitals, whatever.
Yeah,
and I
absolutely.
thought there was a lot of authenticity in Do No Harm because you knew the background.
Oh, well, thank you. I mean, I shadowed in the emergency room on and off for a couple months. I mean, I also had the resources kind of embedded in my family in a way that was nice. Like when I was going after, you know, minutes to burn deals with Navy SEALs, so I like snuck onto demolition ranges with SEALs and blew up cars, and like I've done a lot of bizarre and stupid research over the course of my career. For the program, I went undercover into mind control cults so I could see how they worked, and then I built my own cult. And what was kind of refreshing, well, with the crime writer certainly, but with Do No Harm, is I already know that mindset. I'm very familiar with it. My father's a physician, my grandfather was, my sister is, and so there was no research necessary before dropping into the perspective or the point of view of a character. It was all right there at my fingertips. And I haven't had an experience like that between Do No Harm all the way to the crime writer.
Well, it certainly felt like Do No Harm, and I harp on that because that was the book in which I sort of got to know you. It really felt as though you were inside writing it as opposed to outside, you know, viewing it, which I think is an important distinction.
Yeah.
And I think a reader can feel it, you know, on different levels, how convincing the landscape of the book is.
Right. Well, that's, you know, it's interesting. A lot of reviewers, or I should say a handful of reviewers, thought that I was a doctor. And one of the things that was so interesting about that I realized is a lot of people write, you know, procedurals who aren't cops and even legal thrillers who aren't lawyers, but virtually nobody writes medical thrillers who's not a doctor. And so I thought that was such a weird thing because for me, it's an easier mindset to envision than a PI or a cop. And of course, you know, so many people write PI and cop stories who don't have that background. But for me, like coming from a medical background, it was just interesting how few people will do that unless they're doctors. I mean, Tass Gerritsen is a physician, you know, and her stuff reads great. I mean, she's got that crisp style, and you know, but most people come from the background, and so for me, it was interesting coming outside of it in some ways to try and attack it from there. But I realized that people just don't do that very much.
Not often. Jesse Kellerman's second book is a medical book, and his first one was different, and I think he's gone off to do something. But his wife is a doctor, or was finishing her medical residency, I think, when he wrote the book or whatever. So again, he had someone, you know, to kind of guide him through it.
You know, in some, because it's such its own language.
Yeah.
I mean, it's literally its own language. And I was thinking about when I was writing Do No Harm, you want to strike the balance between having the authenticity in the medical terminology, but only where it's cool patter or where it's relevant to the plot. You can't embed in it because people's eyes will just glaze over. I mean, you need to be able to walk the balance, and so. Not
just glaze over, but not understand it. That's kind of like the choices historical novelists have to make. If you're writing in the 15th century, how much 15th century language, if any, you know, do you want to put in your book? You can't write, you know, Chaucer as the lead character speaking Chaucerian English because nobody would. And you know, there's a really interesting website, for example, I'm sure you know it, etymology.com, where you can go and you have to make decisions about, okay, what are we going to try to do? Are we going to try to make all the nouns true to the time, or are we going to, you know, or you can't say something like in train. You just can't, you know, if you're writing 14th century, because, I mean, what would that mean? You know? So there's a lot, and I'm sure it's no different than when you're doing something scientific, something medical, even you know, legal jargon has its own deal. There is a language.
I mean, the way I always think of it with research is that what's in the book is the tip of the iceberg. That's what you need to show, but you need to figure out the entire iceberg. I mean, you need to build the entire thing to then know, and it's something that I think I'm getting better at, and it took me more drafts to figure out earlier in my career, is what is too much. Because I would do a lot of research, and there's an impetus to put that research in the book because you've done it, and because by the time you're that far in, everything seems interesting. I mean, at least if you're me, I'm kind of a research geek, so I'd get into it and have all these parts, and I'd have to go away and come back and really figure out, well, you know, we don't need 5 things here. You know, pick the one that's compelling, that's got the hook that moves for the plot. And I think it's one thing that's refreshing is having gotten a little further along in my career, I start to do that more instinctively the first draft, so I don't have to kill as many babies in drafts, you know, 3, 4, and 5.
Did you get into writing partly because you just love research? I mean, every book we've ever discussed, you're always in love with the research. I'm using the British pronunciation here, but nevertheless.
You know, I didn't. I got in, I mean, there's a lot of authors who will say, well, you know, I can't read other people when I'm writing because I'm so worried I'll borrow their voice. You know, there's a lot of authors who can't read other people. For me, I love reading. I mean, I read all the time. If I was not able to read when I wrote, when I was working on a book, it wouldn't be worth it to work on a book almost, because, I mean, for me it would just very naturally grow out of the fact of how much I love to read. And the research for me, I think, after, you know, I finished up college and schooling, it's become sort of an excuse for continuing education. But what was funny is getting to the crime writer, I'd already done all that research, because it's very much about what if somebody like me with this bizarre background, doing stupid things, going up in stunt planes, you know, swimming with sharks in Galapagos. You know, I have a lot of random, you know, friends who are criminalists, who are cops, who are spies, and if something happened to a character like that, he would certainly know where to start. But you know, as we know, a little knowledge is a very dangerous thing, and I'm sort of a dilettante. I mean, I don't, you know, I know a little bit about interrogation techniques, crime scene photos. If I'm doing a scene for a book, I can get all the information that I need for that scene, but there's these glaring holes. And the protagonist and the crime writer very quickly finds out that it's like a lot of what he or we as crime writers think that we know is these are false notions. We've imported them from other books, from pop culture, from TV. And so it's kind of funny, this is the first book I didn't do any research for. I just sat down and, you know, page 1, chapter 1. That's it, you know, just start writing. Because it's all about that bizarre, you know, interplay.
Well, it's the book you were sort of born to write in that sense. That's true. But I've always had that sense that writing for you was really like perpetual graduate school. And to me, actually, working in books has been the same. People always ask me, why is it, you know, that crime fiction, which I think is a more inclusive term than mystery, so that's why I use it these days. You know, why is it that has absorbed me more than all the other things? Because you know me, I'm a book junkie. I read, you know, dozens of books a week. And I think it's because you always get to learn from good crime writers such cool stuff. And so you wind up, as you say, with this sort of rag bag, you know.
Well, and for me, it's a good excuse to go shine a flashlight in a really dark corners. I mean, like, I've always, with the program, for instance, I've always been really fascinated with cults and how cults function. And, you know, in LA, people say, well, how did you find cults to go undercover into? I say, I lived in Los Angeles. People only ask that if they're outside of LA. If you're in LA, you know. I walked out of my house and promptly got invited to 6 things. But, you know, you walk by and you see the groups and the testing and the centers, and I always wanted to know what's behind that door. I always wanted to know. And so writing a book's a good excuse to do enough research that I could safely go behind those doors, figure it out. What are the mechanisms they use? If I push this hard, who's going to come back at me? And same with, you know, with Troubleshooter, the next one, you know, about outlaw biker gangs. I mean, biker gangs are one of those other things. If you're in a roadside bar, you know, you kind of want to half look and see what they're up to. What does the culture mean? What's behind it? And it was a good, you know, I learned how to ride a Harley. I went on bikers runs and went into biker bars, and certainly didn't push my luck too far. But, you know, it was, again, a great excuse to delve into the subculture that unless you're going to take it really seriously, it's not a very safe subculture to delve into.
You know, that's a really good point, because you were at risk with the cult, you were at risk with the bikers.